Well, Jim, good morning. Thank you for joining us for the last of our 10 conversations with.
Glad to be here.
Thank you, Jim. Today's final topic is the topic of literature, right? The written word. And I wanted to start maybe at a very fundamental level. And I was curious as I was preparing for today to ask you about the first time, we think of literature as a collected thing, right? And I wondered in antiquity, if thinking about the Greeks, when they thought about the written texts that were part of their world, would they have considered that literature? And if so, was it defined the way we think about it, or they think about it in a different way?
I think that they would have included texts that weren't written as literature, namely Homer and the other early poets. And I don't know that they would have distinguished. They would not have made the clear distinctions that we make. For instance, the pre-Socratic philosophers wrote in verse, and Aristotle takes up, I think it's in the Poetics, whether we should consider these people as philosophers or as poets, because they are writing in verse. And he concludes that we should think of them as philosophers because of the subject matter, and not poets because their works fit into poetic meters. Of course, when Aristotle was writing, prose had been around only for maybe 150 years. The first prose work in European culture is Herodotus. But the disciplines and the separation of different texts into philosophy and drama and economics and mathematics didn't exist in early Greek times. It was all the texts were letters and were a sign of culture. Don't forget that until the 5th or 6th century, literacy was exceedingly rare because there was no formal grammar or any agreed upon ways of writing. And even in all of antiquity, the rate of literacy was exceedingly low, maybe 1% of the population, or maybe 2% at most. And it certainly didn't include women. For the most part, there would be, one in a very large number of women who had been taught to read. On the other hand, slaves were taught to read, and they were the ones who did the reading. For instance, if you wanted to read a book, your slave would simply read it to you, and you would sit back and enjoy yourself.
Jim, it strikes me that when you think about poetry or Herodotus, even Thucydides, write the early novels, and you come back down to this issue of the story, right? This fundamental construct of a story of this thing happened to someone, right, or to some place, or to
right. But with some forms of text, there was no story. The lyric poetry expresses an emotion that somebody is feeling at that moment, or the pre-Socratic, the ones we call the poets, we call the pre-Socratics, were expressing a view about the nature of the universe. And it was often just apothegms, just what we would say is our maxims or sayings, proverbs, and that's what they would write. But but many of the very earliest texts tell a story, like Homer, the epic poems. But Hesiod is not much of a storyteller. He tells a lot of little stories, and that makes up his book, say the Works and Days or the Theogony. So we need really to be careful when we talk about literature. It becomes safer to talk about literature, some from the 4th century on. And Plato is a good example of the problems that people have when they pick up a text of Plato. They just assume that it's going to be philosophy because they find it in the philosophy department of a bookstore or in the library. But in Plato's time, I don't think Plato thought that he was writing philosophy. He was writing what Aristotle calls the Socratic Conversations. And they begin with a dramatic situation, and then the participants, the interlocutors, the people who are speaking to each other, develop the conversation from that conversation. Some of the dialogues of Plato look just like plays, and Plato is said, we don't know whether it's true, but it's an apocryphal story, that he wanted to be a tragedian, and then he met Socrates and he decided to write about those things. But if students didn't hear about Plato ahead of time and they just saw a text like the Crito or some of the others that just looked like plays, it would take them a while before they thought, they're talking about these abstract subjects. And so Plato mixes up all the genres. In fact, I would say that he resembles ancient comedy, the comedies of Aristophanes. He uses real figures and he makes up the conversations.
Jim, I was curious, what do you think happens when in this period when you transition from the story, the verbal narrative, right, is sort of the foundational element of, call it, that storytelling, and it begins to be written down.
Well,
what do you think is lost and what's gained?
Well, actually, Plato takes up this exact subject at the end of the Phaedrus. He talks about the king of Egypt. I think his name is Thumus, who invents writing, or maybe somebody else invents it, and he criticizes the invention of writing. But writing is criticized intensely for ruining people's ability to remember. It's certainly the case of my students. You ask them a question and they say, well, I have it written in my notes, but it doesn't, they don't remember it. They think if they have it in their notebook, it's enough. Today, people think, well, I don't need to remember anything because I can look it up instantly on the internet and get the answer. That was one objection, was that it decreased the ability of people to remember. But the more important objection that's raised by Plato in that dialogue is that once the author is dead, and if it's a complicated text, you can't ask him what he meant, and so it's like looking at a painting. Who knows, especially you look at paintings today, modern paintings, you have no idea what they mean. And especially it's the case when the painter doesn't give a name to the painting, but he just says study number 65. You have no idea what it is that he's doing without a text. And once the painter is dead, you can't even ask him what he meant. And that's the same for literary works. They don't talk to you. They can't talk to you. They're silent. Just what you suggested in your question. So I forget what your question was, but this was the problem.
Right. The transition from a story-based culture, which is mostly verbal, to one that begins to write things down, and how that changes, and the limitations of having to take a complex concept, like you said, and then finding words to explain it.
Yeah. I think that the early writers didn't tell you all of the story. For instance, Plato in the dialogues, or Herodotus, he just gives you the sketch of the story, and you have to fill in the details, and you have to do a lot of thinking in order to understand what's going on. And that's also true for the stories in the Bible. That's why there's so many interpretations of them, because they're intentionally not telling you everything. There's no omniscient narrator who wants to share absolutely everything. And I think those are the books that stand the test of time, because they give you something to argue about. Nobody's going to reread and think about a textbook that explains everything clearly so that the students will not have to struggle with the text. You know, the books that are difficult, like Shakespeare, which is really hard, or the ancient works, you know, they're hard. There's a simplification that takes place after you've and that happens in the 5th century when Herodotus and Thucydides were writing. Those histories are much harder to read than the histories that came in the 4th century by people like Theopompus, and they're not remembered very much. You know, it's the difficult ones. Even in Roman times, like Tacitus, are much more read and studied because they're complicated. You know, they give you much more to think about.
Tim, when you think about, when we talk about for a second, just fiction, not history, but something that's invented for some other purpose, it strikes me that of all the arts, the novelist is closest to a teacher, right? The one who has the most capacity to take an ethical or moral position in something and through a story to kind of explain that. Do you see it the same way?
Well, novels have the advantage of giving you a lot of space, you know, and a novelist can write a long novel or a short novel depending on how much he wants to say. And the novel is really a wonderful literary form, but it lends itself to really great novels and also really pretty superficial novels. I think if we remember Longinus and his great work on the sublime, he says that a work is really great if it gives you something to think about and think about after you've read it, so you can return to it and think about it some more. And I would think that that's true of the novel that you wrote about Falcone. That was a novel that gave you plenty to think about while you were reading it, and afterwards you continued to think about it. You just didn't put it down. It wasn't like the books that I remember from being a little boy in single digits and reading the Hardy Boys novels. They were a lot of fun to read. I love them, and I love Tom Swift too. I really did. I was addicted to those novels, but my parents didn't care. They were, glad I wasn't reading comic books, which I also read and enjoyed. But they don't leave you those books didn't leave you anything to think about afterwards.
You think you're able to say a novel is great because of X, Y, and Z? What is that?
Yeah, well, I would say that a novel, since you're asking me, I would say that what makes a novel great is that it deals with profound matters. It's not just finding who murdered the storekeeper, which was the plot of or who robbed the store, because in the Hardy Boys the crimes were never really murders. I don't remember murders, but or they're not like silly romance novels that people read where the lovers live happily ever after, or after a whole bunch of tribulations in getting there. But you can have a romantic novel like The Betrothed by Alessandro Manzoni, but the romance is only part of the story. The story deals with so much more. So I think choosing an important topic or dealing with a big issue or having an idea that you want to communicate, and you want to communicate it through drama, not a play drama, but through the dramatic events of life, that can potentially be a great novel. And another requirement is that it be well written, so that it does that. And by well written, I don't mean that it has to be in formal English, but there has to be an appropriateness between the content and the story. The way in an opera, the music should fit what's going on, so it should be emotionally appropriate for what the characters are saying in the opera, and the father of one of my friends was a music professor who thought that Mozart's Magic Flute was the most perfect of all operas because the music fit like a glove on a hand, And I think that's also true of novels or other works of literature.
How do you think that manifests itself? Because these themes are in a way you could say they're sort of timeless. They don't change, but language is always changing. So the right words for theme A in the 1700s are no longer the right words in the 1800s or in the 21st century.
Yeah.
Or there's just some magic of congruence between language and the theme that keeps changing over the centuries.
Well, and we who teach at Hampden-Sydney have seen that very problem that you raise. Shakespeare, for example, is writing in the 16th, early 17th century, and his plays are unintelligible to many students. In fact, even in the 40 years that I've been at Hampden-Sydney, the students used to be able to read plays like King Lear. And when we adopted the Western Culture Program, Diana Rhodes, who is a dear friend of mine, suggested that we switch, since everybody was going to have to read the play, to The Merchant of Venice, which was a much easier play. And it worked for the first few years, but then even that was too difficult. I started using an edition which explained all the Shakespearean language in modern English on the other side of the page. And that worked a little better. And then some other people whose names I won't mention told me there was something called Shakespeare Without Fear, which just translated the Shakespeare page by page into modern English. Mm-hmm. But there was a big loss in the metaphors and in the beauty of Shakespeare's language. But it's like reading a translation of Homer. Luckily, we've lived in an era when there were lots of really good translations of Homer into modern English, like those of Richmond Lattimore, which was the one that was used when I was in college, and then there was Fitzgerald of the Odyssey, and then the poet Fagles did both the Odyssey and the Iliad, and those are really wonderful translations. So since Greek is so hard and so few people study it, it would be a real loss for the world if they weren't able to read Homer in translation. And I suppose that's going to be the case. Samuel Johnson, or Gibbon is another example. He's a wonderful writer. Edward Gibbon, The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And it's the best book on Roman history, even if it's not completely up to date. But students today have a hard time reading 18th century English, which is one of my favorites. So yeah, I think you're right. And so every age will produce its own contemporary writers that are appealing, but that doesn't mean that the old ones are no good anymore. They still deal with big issues, and we need people to translate them into contemporary English.
Like every age has to write its version of King Lear, or its Moby Dick, or its Heart of Darkness. As the language evolves, it has the themes
or things like it. Yes, I wouldn't want to say they. There's a line in Gilbert and Sullivan that goes like this: "Of course you will pooh-pooh whatever's fresh and new, and declare it crude and mean, for art stopped short in the cultivated court of the Empress Josephine." So Gilbert and Sullivan are making fun of somebody who didn't want to read anything past the Napoleonic age.
That exact moment where it stops.
Yeah, and there's still people like that.
Jim, there's I think it's a professor at Harvard, Dave Darmush, I think, who wrote this book called World Literature, and it's about a lot of it was about translation, and he writes that any work is sort of translated, right, it then sort of exists in this sort of nether world. I think it calls an elliptical space between the source and kind of the receiver, right? And it's interesting to think of Shakespeare now entering that state where, as if it were Homer, it neither exists in its original context, right, nor in our context. We have to translate Shakespeare into English, it seems, in order for it to be understood.
But that's even true for the speeches, say, of Winston Churchill or Kennedy, or even more recent things. And you can see how the change in the language is accelerating in the age of the internet, where people correspond with each other in words, Twitter, which is the song of a bird, which this is very ephemeral. And I think it's a good name for the medium.
Maybe that's what this comes down to, right? That what's buried kind of or contained by the language, that's the thing that are always lost. And so what makes something great is that every generation finds the effort to unpack the language to get to the essence of what's underneath it, that it's worth it, right? And that's what a great work of literature is, something that no matter how many layers of language are piled on top of it, almost like an archaeological, right, metaphor, that it's worth going through all that, because at the bottom there's this treasure that it's worth the effort to find, and that you're not going to, and each one is a little bit different, right? That's what you.
Well, I think what you're saying is exactly right. Though it contains the lamentable fact that people hear the word classic, and they won't look at it. They just assume classic is a synonym for boring, and so they won't read it. I mean, I taught Walden at Hampden-Sydney in the Rhetoric 102, the theme section, and there Thoreau says that the classics are really wonderful. The only people who don't like them are those who've never read them, and I think that's true. I know that a lot of students that I've had, they had no idea what was in the classics, and they read a few of them in class that were assigned. They read them because they were going to have a quiz. They wouldn't have read them voluntarily if they could have avoided it. And they fell in love with the classics. And I too, when I need to read a novel on an airplane past 8 hours, on those rare trips that I take to Europe, I always choose a classic novel. I don't want to risk, I want to choose a classic novel that is one that has stood the test of time and has been praised for a long time. It's not likely that the risk is much less than reading just one that I find in the bookstore of the airport.
Jim, you mentioned two traits of a great novel, right? The theme is a serious theme and worthy of the effort. Second, the language is appropriate to the topic. Anything else that you think, say all great novels have this in common?
Well, all of them? I don't know that.
Most.
Well, I think the great thing about novels is they're so varied. I mean, the novels that I like to read have a really good plot. And so it's not just the ideas or the language, but the plot. And I have to agree with Aristotle here, who says, in the Poetics, when he's talking about plays, that the most important thing is the plot. If you're going to tell a story, it has to be a good story. It can't just be in abstractions.
There's a great segue into my next topic, and that is books like Finnegan's Wake, right? Writers like Joyce, who push language beyond sometimes.
Yeah,
what a document is, right?
Well, I confess, I tried to. I know that I have colleagues in English who say that Ulysses is a great novel, and I've tried on a number of occasions to read it, but I can't get, it's just it's too much, it's too impressionistic. It's just too hard to read it. So I don't think a novel like that will ever.
And yet, at the end of the 20th century, Joyce's books were almost universally at the top of the greatest novels ever written.
Right? Yeah, but
how do you explain the fact that something like Ulysses, everybody says it's the greatest book ever written, and yet almost no one understands even what it is?
Maybe it's peer pressure, but I would choose to read the Don Quixote, which I've read a couple of times. It always repays the effort, and also the Count of Monte Cristo, or the things like that. They're not, or Jane Austen. Her novels are just so wonderful. I don't know that one could read Ulysses with delight.
Mm-hmm.
At least I couldn't. I don't want to say nobody could, but I'm just not bright enough to be able to read it. But I'll try again, maybe when I retire.
So when someone says this is a great novel, this is the greatest of all novels in English literature, what do you think they're saying?
That they liked it a lot. It's like somebody says, I just went to the best restaurant on the planet, and how could they know it? I remember when I was first married, Barbara said, you're the best husband in the world. And I said, well, how do you know that? I mean, there could be some husband in Tibet who's even better. You don't know that. And I think that people, it's a rhetorical statement. It's not a dialectical or philosophical statement.
I assume when these lists are being put together, and these are all professors, right, scholars, they're not just saying I liked it.
But how could they haven't read all the stuff? I mean, an unknown author like yourself, you might have written a novel for the ages. I think your novel is a novel for the ages. It's really a wonderful book, but people they don't know about it, and so they're unwilling to take the risk. They find a big volume forbidding, and it could be, who knows how many wonderful things are out there.
I wanted to talk a little bit about not novels, but characters in novels, right? And as you begin to build the character, at least from my experience writing my novel, was that as characters, as the novel went on, you really start to think of these people as people who you sort of imagine that they were for real. You ask yourself, would he really have done this, or would she really have done this? You sort of begin to form this sort of idea of them as human beings.
Well, more than that, you worry about them. You go to bed at night and you wonder what mischief. How is he going to get out of the predicament?
You actually feel sad when something bad happens in the book. There's a kind of pain of even just writing it down. You're almost kind of to tears of that. This very sad outcome happens.
I'm glad you brought that up. About the characters. A character needs to be true to life. So, novels that are going to be about Superman or Batman are excluded from any possibility of greatness, because it's impossible for us on Earth to identify with somebody who can fly and do all those things. So I think there needs to be some resemblance to reality. But it's been said that a novel can never be about a good man being good. It can be about a good person overcoming evil, but you can't just have that goodness is not in itself particularly interesting. And Tolstoy said something about that about families, that all happy families are exactly the same, so they wouldn't make good story for a novel, but miserable families are much more interesting. And that is true. I think I've had some but when it comes to the characters, I've had some other thoughts too. I had a professor who said that women writers don't portray men as well as men portray women in their novels. And because I was young, I believed what he said. But I think that was a prejudice on his part. He thought male writers portrayed men better because he himself was a male and thought in masculine terms. But and it could be that males portray males better, but he was maintaining also that men portray women better than and I think that was a mistake, because he would see women as a man sees women, and so that was a false claim. But I think the women writers who started very late in the 18th century are really responsible for a lot of good in the world. And by writing their novels, they showed that women really had the same sensorium, the same moral sensitivities, and the same ability to think clearly and in complex terms as men did. And it took a very long time, but I believe that the women's movement really began with the women writers who persuaded men that women really were at least equal to men. And as more women writers wrote, and as it was discovered that people like, say, George Eliot
mm-hmm.
was
George
a woman.
Was woman, right? Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Look, Jim, doesn't it? It's an nonsensical statement to me. It comes down to your understanding of a thing, right? There's the great characters are created by people who understand
nature and human nature
and the nature of a thing, right? The nature of a man, the nature of a woman. There's no more reason for any one man or any woman to understand the nature of a human being ahead of time, right? A priori, you either do or you don't. To the extent that you understand something, the essence of a thing, the nature of a thing, then you're able to sort of to write about it.
Yes, but it depends on the experiences that you've had. If you've been locked up in a room only with other women, you know, in the way ancient Greek girls were, you wouldn't have opportunity to understand men.
What do you think about this issue of the constraint of, if you haven't experienced something, you can't write about it? Which is, some people think they say write what you know. So if you were a baker, your novel should be about baking. If you were a jailhouse guard,
nobody believes that. I had a colleague here who criticized me for something that I wrote on the subject of abortion, and he criticized me for that if I hadn't had an abortion and if I weren't a woman, I couldn't write on the subject. But this very same person taught, Renaissance English, and wrote about the characters, even the female ones in Shakespeare. And so I replied that how could he write about Renaissance people if he wasn't living in the Renaissance? This idea that you have to experience something would really eliminate most literature. How could you write about a murderer if you weren't a murderer, or about a hunchback if you didn't even know any hunchbacks?
Yeah.
So I think it's a crazy view. How could you write a book about theology if you weren't a god yourself? I think I'm of course driving it to absurdity, but it is an absurd view.
And there's something about writing in a place for a time that isn't your own, that requires an extra amount of effort, right, on your part, to say, what is the essence of the thing that I'm trying to transmit? You pick that place and time, sometimes for a literary purpose. There is something about that location, right, or that moment that heightens the point that you're trying to make. It's not a neutral decision. You don't pick a revolutionary America randomly. Maybe there was some element of existence that is heightened at that moment, and that's why you pick that particular time and place. If you make it as a literary decision, I think the best writers don't just pick a location or a time or a place or a setting without thinking about how does the nature of the entire, where the characters are, right, and what is happening, that has to be part of what makes the whole thing come together.
Yes. Well, I think that you might have a writer who's writing on a who's philosophical, and you might have a writer, but I think all writers, whether they are philosophical and are writing a work for all time, or whether they're just writing a work about something that interests them, always have in mind a contemporary audience. So a writer who picks a historical topic, let's say about corruption in politics and say in the Boss Tweed time, he still has in mind his contemporary audience. So he's going to tell the story in such a way that it'll resonate with people who are aware of contemporary politics. And that was definitely true in ancient times when the great writers of drama, for example, would take a mythological scene and it would have contemporary significance for their own time. And a good example of it is Euripides, say, in the Medea, where he has, the Medea occurs 10 or 15 years after Jason got the golden fleece in the voyage of the Argonauts. And now which was a very heroic moment for him, and he's still lingering on his glory days of getting the golden fleece. But now it's years later, and he's engaging in horrible things. He's abandoning his wife. He's going after another one for her money, and it's a play ends badly. But I think Euripides is talking to his Athenian audience. He's saying, yeah, he's writing right before the Peloponnesian War and during it. And he's saying to the Athenian audience, yeah, you have those glory days when you defeated Persia. That was your glory days. But now you're doing horrible things. And so if they were looking at the play and understanding his lesson for contemporary people, he would be doing it in a way that didn't mention Athens. Jason had, very little to do with Athens, though there was some dealing with Athens because Medea escapes to Athens at the end of the play. But the Athenians would be thinking, we don't want to be like Jason, just remembering our glory days. We need to continue to be good. We can't just rest on our laurels. And later on, in Roman times, they would take old people, historical people who were really villainous, but it was clear that they were talking about the contemporary emperors who were really horrible. So it was safe for them to do that because you couldn't talk about a contemporary person in a police state.
And it reminds me of a psychiatric phenomenon that I read about, where the psychiatrist is working with a patient has some terrible thing that has happened to her and can't talk about it. And so you invent a sort of fictional character in a fictional place and time, call her Jane. So what happened to Jane? Well, Jane was abused, or Jane was this. And for some period of time in the therapeutic process, this fictional story of Jane allows the person who has been harmed to tell the story, and eventually, of course, right, we understand that there wasn't any Jane, it was this person. And so I think the same thing happens in literature. There are things that perhaps an author says, I can't, you will not deal with this directly. So let's create a construct that allows us to have this dialogue, to talk about this thing, right? And eventually it becomes right? Something that you're able to process through the mechanism of the story. That allows you, which engage that you may want to engage. And like you said, to that, from that extreme to the where someone creates a completely artificial story about the present, but told in a way that if you're, I mean, their censors might read it. I know it happens. And well, it's a book about a tree. There were books in Chinese literature, contemporary Chinese literature, that it's a book about a tree, right? And there was one I could think about, the King of Trees. It's not about a tree. It's about communist China, but the story is about this tree. And that's a great tree near a town, and they want to come and chop it down. And so there's this debate that starts about, this is the king of trees and it needs to be left unharmed, and the ambiguity of what is the tree in the story and who is debating to keep it and who's debating to cut it down allows you to have a political discussion.
And I think that you have to hope that the censors are dull enough so that they don't see the relevance. There was a professor at Harvard before I was born, Harry Wolfson, who wrote about Philo, and I had one of his students, Louis Feldman, who had Harry Wolfson when he was at Harvard, and Feldman reported that Wolfson said, I didn't want to take any credit for it, so I wanted to give you the whole pedigree of this because I thought it was a true statement and one of complete relevance to the topic, said that all scholarship is autobiography, and I think it's clear what he meant once you hear it. That the things that you write about are things that are interesting to you, and you choose those, and the way you analyze it all comes really from the inside of the scholar. But I would extend that. Now I'm going beyond Wolfson to say even all novelists are writing autobiography. Whatever you do, even your novel about Falcone, it came from your soul. It came from your mind and the way you thought about things and the way you describe heroic action on the one hand or a vile action on the other hand in the novel. It all came out of you. And so it was really an offspring. Sometimes people love their children more than the children deserves, but that's not true of good writers who have good children, good intellectual offspring. So I wanted to get that out.
I wanted to talk about one other thing, and that's imitation. One of the interesting things about great works is how we feel compelled to recreate them in some way, right? So you have 50 different versions of Hamlet or Richard III, and
or 1,000. Every production is a little different.
Yeah, they'll set it in 1940s Germany or something like that, right? So when the Odyssey especially comes to mind in all the different ways. I've heard it as a song by Steely Dan, as a movie with Roy Old Brother We're Out Now. So yes, what do you think is this human trait to try to recreate it in somehow? It's sort of perfect, or at least it stands. You can just read the Odyssey if you're if you love it so much. Why recreate it in a song, a play, a movie? What is it? What is it?
I can give you one more example. I was teaching the Antigone in my Greek class, and just that year there happened to be a professor visiting in the rhetoric program who was from Africa, and he had done his dissertation on African versions of Sophocles' Antigone. So naturally, I invited him to my class. We spent the whole day, and he explained the different versions of it in different places in Africa, and it was really quite riveting to see how they took the basic storyline of the play. And of course, they do that. Yeah, the Odyssey is one of the favorite ones because it lends itself to all adaptations, because it has so many different parts. The Iliad has fewer imitations, but it's not without its imitations as well. Well, because the great plots, the great ones are very inspirational to others, but also when somebody has gotten a great idea like Homer, and it can be read at so many different levels, and and the different levels are always interesting to us. What constitutes a human being's identity? And is it something which is fixed, or is it fluid? Can people really change, or even in their changed form, is there something still left? These are issues that arise in Homer and in so many novels, and modern literary works. The great ideas are subject to many permutations and in variant forms. And that's part of the glory of the earth. Let me draw an analogy. You have a watch, no doubt, or a clock, and you think of the watch. It has 12 hours and it's round. I'm only talking about analog clocks now. And think how many tens of thousands of watch faces there are. Many of them really beautiful, some of them goofy, but the requirements of the face are very limited. It's round or square, and it has the hands, or one or two or three hands, and it can only there's so few elements, and yet it allows for such an infinite variety. Well, think about an event in life. How much more complicated it is than just a watch face. I'm touching it, but you can you see it. It's very simple, and yet there's so many zillions of different ones. Some go for $5. This one went for $15. But you can look in the Wall Street Journal magazine that comes out every few weeks, and you can get one for $25,000 or even more. And they all basically do the same thing, and yet they're even this structure allows for such variety.
One of the interesting modern literary phenomenon is something called fan fiction, where somebody writes a story using characters from another story. So let's just, I think the most common one.
Yes, I've seen those with Jane Austen,
Right, or Star Wars is sort of
right.
Probably the biggest source of this, or somebody takes the characters and reinvents their own sort of version.
Right.
Which seems.
I thought of some of them myself, like Samuel Johnson meets Benjamin Franklin, and have them do something together, some adventure.
Kind of literary remix sort of phenomenon. And my sense is that when, for whatever reason, something strikes a chord with people, like in the let me make my version of the Odyssey, or let me write my follow on to what happens after the Star Wars thing ends. People right. want to be associated, like they want these things to live on, right? There's a sense. So to me, to add one thought to what makes a great novel is you want these characters to be real, flawed as they may be, but you want them to exist and you want to interact with them in some way.
And don't you suppose there's a competitiveness too? If you're writing your own version of the Odyssey, you want to outdo Homer. So you're really competing with him, and good luck to you to try to do that. But if people didn't try to outdo the great authors of the past, things.
It's a funny relationship we have with these fictional characters. I grew up reading Sherlock Holmes, Conan Doyle.
And I did too, yeah.
When I was in London last year, we went to Baker Street, right? And which, of course, has nothing to do with Conan Doyle, but it's just that there was something about being on that street, and you see the little sign, and who knows whether it's even what Doyle actually thought when he was alive. But there's a strange thing of wanting Sherlock Holmes. So I think it's the most portrayed character in the history of literature, right?
In movies, yeah,
to exist, and you get to the point where you don't want to be reminded that there wasn't a friendship of Holmes and Watson. These two characters didn't actually share a small apartment. It's a funny thing where it gets to the point where we want it to be real, right?
Well,
or Emma, right?
I've
right?
I've written on the subject of truth in fiction, and you know, a story can be completely made up, but it still could be true. For instance, the example that I use in class, and you've probably heard it before, is the story of George Washington chopping down the cherry tree. Well, it's, you know, it's a fiction, but the story is so good that you would, you know, if you had a choice to somebody from a foreign country who wanted just one book to read about American history, and one book, they were exactly the same, two books that were the contenders, and one of them had the story of George Washington in the tree, and the other one omitted that story. Which would you give the stranger? And I believe that everybody would give him the story of George Washington cutting down the tree, even though it's a fiction, because it says so much about the character of him and why he was admired, and so on. And so the story really is true. It's like the friendship of Watson and Holmes, you know?
And it's something about that a fictional story, there's never going to be a real friendship that'll get to the level of something like that, because it sort of encompasses all friendships, right? As an author, you're able to create this fictional friendship, which is almost representative of all friendships. There's never be any one individual real friendship that can attain that complete friendship sort of is in a fictional.
You can say that the fictional one sort of is the brandy. It's the distillation of what a friendship is, and so it differs from grape juice the way brandy differs from, well, brandy the fictional friendship differs from a real friendship the way brandy differs from grape juice.
And because in a novel you get to see it from so many different perspectives, little details, big arcs, it's something that's hard to do when it comes to real stories. Jim, I know we only have a few minutes left. I wanted to talk as a last topic about maybe what you think is either the greatest novel, if you have something, one that you would pick, or your favorite, and why do you think it's great, or why is it your favorite? There's a famous desert island. If you could take one novel with you, that's all you were allowed. What do you take with you?
Well, I would say, I would quote my father on that. It would be a novel about building a ship to escape from the desert island. But it would
novel where a classics professor successfully escapes by building a ship.
Though the Odyssey has that big scene where Odysseus is building a raft, but I wouldn't pick that. Would it? Are you giving me okay? I will exclude your novel because it's yours.
Right.
So I would. It's a difficult question because there are a lot of them that have given me great joy, and the one that I mentioned before, Don Quixote, is such a rich book that I might choose that. I also did like Tristram Shandy that you like.
My favorite.
I like, but it would be like asking me to choose which of my children I would like to be with, or which of my former students I would keep with me on the island. You know, it's very hard there. Luckily, we live on planet Earth, which has a lot of good novels, and so there's a big choice. And by novel, I assume you meant the genre, so I couldn't pick an epic poem or something like that.
There's something about Cervantes, isn't there? This remarkable theme of imagining a world, right? And which we all do, right? We all live in some construct that we create for ourselves, and this amazing human thing of going on we are all on this campaign, right? To slay the dragons, save the princess, right? Be the heroes in some way, in our own small way, right? To me, if you say, okay, the greatest novel, I go to that one.
Which one?
To Quixote. It's just.
So you're stealing my novel.
Well, you didn't want to pick.
You're going to be on the next island.
So,
I guess we could yell at each other.
While you couldn't decide, I took it off the shelf. I took it with me. I think it's just remarkable. I have like 10 different versions of it, or different languages that I collect, and one for little kids. Read it in Spanish, in English, in French, and there's just something about it. It's this just pure human condition of longing, of delusion, of hope, right? Of exaltation, of beauty. It's just amazing. It's all novels in one novel.
This is a good way to end, because you're taking over with a novel that I was going to have on my island. But I'm delighted. That's
the first choice.
That you're a kindred spirit.
Right? Spirits, right? That's what we can end on that note, that we'd be fighting over the last copy of Don Quixote if the world came to an end.
Yeah, but remember, Don Quixote does say something about the earlier subject. He talks about reading a translation, and he says that reading a translation is like looking at the back of a tapestry. So I would think that it would be worth becoming skilled in Spanish to read Don Quixote in Spanish. And I can read Spanish, but I need to use, I'm not fluent in it.
As it is, learning Greek to read Homer, right? Learning Latin to read Tacitus.
Right. But luckily, there are some really good translations of Don Quixote. Yeah.
Well, Chip, look, I know we're out of time, and I guess as a final thought, I just wanted to say, first of all, thank you for your patience and participating in all these conversations with your friends and former students. It's been a pleasure for me to be an audience member, and I'm now a participant in the series. It's a joy always to speak with you, and a privilege to get a chance to see you in conversation with people who have meant so much to you over your life. So thank you for that. And we started this project in commemoration again of your last year of as an active professor. Our teaching never ends. And on a personal note, I just wanted to say my thank you to you for having been a teacher, for having taught me how to write and how to read, and then for being a friend all these years. Thank you very much.
Well, I want to thank you for organizing these. It's been a great joy for me too. And I should just say about this last one that this was the most dangerous of all of them, because we had no moderator.
And yet we survived.
We did, yes. And we discovered that we admired that we would have the same book.
Same book
on the desert.
Thank you very much. Wish you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.